My guest this evening is a perfect example of how to do things right. In 2012, he introduced himself before moderating a guest panel at the Crypticon Seattle convention. Pleasant and well-spoken, he then proceeded to set the bar for how guest introduction should be done. I have yet to see anyone else do better. The bar has been set that high. Any guest introduction I've done on this virtual tour has been inspired by this man's fine example. He writes for the Sunbreak, Artist Home, and entertains genre fans with his City of Geek podcast. He is a gentleman and a scholar. Please welcome to the Eclectic Arts virtual studio, Mr. Tony K.
Hey, Mark, thank you for that wonderful intro.
Oh no, thank you.
Oh my God, I'm immeasurably flattered that I set an example for you, that I inspired you to do what you've done here. So thank you for that.
No, again, thank you. As we were talking pre-show, it's very true. I'm not blowing smoke of any kind. You basically set the template for me 8 years ago of how this should be done. And again, I've been to many panels, and that's not throwing shade at any of the other moderators, but you're kind of in another league in terms of how you go about your business. So just thank you for taking the time to join with me today. I can't wait to get into this.
Absolutely. Absolutely. My pleasure, Mark.
Awesome.
What do you want to talk about?
I want to start with, as I've been starting with all of the guests here, even though you're local, how are you faring during this unprecedented time during the pandemic? How are things going for you?
I feel like I'm doing as well as anybody out there. I am very fortunate in that my day job is still intact and I'm still working full time and getting a paycheck. Thank heavens for that. I live across the street from Green Lake, which is a lovely little park here in Seattle, and I will sneak out there either very early in the morning or very late at night and do a lap just to clear my head and not have to have as much worry about constant mask wearing. And I've also been trying to keep busy with writing, and keep motivated. And it can be a struggle. I mean, I think it is that way for a lot of us. But yeah, I mean, I keep keeping on, and there's always something inspiring to me creatively, because like you, I write about art, I write about film, I write about music, and just when you find your motivation kind of starting to wane, along comes a music or a film or something that just kind of knocks your socks off and reminds you of what it's like to be human. And those are the things that are keeping me going during this pandemic.
Yeah, no, I mean, you said it very well. And I think we definitely agree about that. Certain things are what kind of help float your boat that much more when it feels like it's starting to sink a bit during this pandemic. That
Absolutely.
Here comes this, and like, oh, thank goodness, something for me to get excited about. And then that kind of takes me away from all of this over here. Yeah. I can now kind of focus on that.
Absolutely.
And there's so many things that people out there that know you. There's probably some Crypticon Seattle people that are watching this right now that know you from that. There we go, the horror nerd camp. And exactly. we're going to get to that in a few minutes. But to kind of lead up to it, as I was telling you pre-show, some people that I feel like I know, moderately well, I don't know every detail about them. They don't know everything about me. And in your case, you were born here in Tacoma. Is that correct?
Yeah, Madigan Army Hospital in Tacoma. Yeah, I'm one of those rare lifelong native Northwesterners. I was born in Tacoma. I spent most of my childhood and adolescence living in Spanaway, Washington, which is a little tiny burg about 10 miles south of Tacoma, I would say. And then from there, moved back and forth all over the state, settled in Seattle proper quite a few years ago, and have been living for the last 5 years in the Wallingford neighborhood of Seattle. So I'm like, I've done a little bit of traveling, but I'm pretty much a lifer. I've been here living in Seattle and in Washington State my whole life.
Okay, so there's something we have in common, because I was born in Seattle, raised in Kirkland. My parents' house is still there. They're watching this right now, I'm sure.
My
So
parents are still living in the same house I grew up in Spanaway. They're total technical Luddites, so they're probably not watching this, um, but yeah, they're still here. You know, my roots are not very far from here. They're 40 miles south. So yeah.
yeah, I love being up here, and anytime I travel somewhere else, as much as I might enjoy that, I can't really picture myself living in these other places. And even for myself, one of the things I love about it here is we have all four seasons.
Yeah,
You're going to know
absolutely.
when you have fall to winter to spring and summer, and they typically aren't too drastic. We have some exceptions, of course, but it's nothing like the winters of Chicago or
Oh,
the
God, I
summers of
know.
Arizona or something.
Yeah.
Um, so
I mean, I'm with you on that totally.
So when you're Tacoma, Spanaway, other parts of the state, um, what was young Tony like? When did you start eventually getting into? Were you going to the cinema every Saturday? Where did this kind of build up from?
You know, I literally my first childhood memory was watching a movie, and it was watching a horror movie. It was the Boris Karloff 1932 version of The Mummy. And
Ah,
I remember this very vividly because I remember that whole wonderful opening scene, sitting on a couch, my mom on one side, family dog in the center, and I was feeding the dog popcorn and ice cubes because that's what you do when you're a little kid, and watching this movie and watching this desiccated Egyptian corpse come to life and drive a guy berserk, you know, with just one glance. I was captivated. So like literally from as far as I can remember, I've always found considerable enchantment with genre cinema, with horror movies. Those were my gateway drug into cinema. I was very fortunate to have been just old enough to have seen a lot of movies first run in theaters, a lot of like kind of the formative 70s and 80s horror movies that I can think of offhand, and also some of the not so great and not so formative ones. Well, I saw The Incredible Melting Man 3 times in its general release in its first run. So yeah, that's the kind of hardcore I am. But yeah, I mean, I just back then, because I've got a few years on most of the people who are likely listening to this, there wasn't even really home video. It was a situation where you had maybe 5 different TV channels, and if there was a movie that was on one of those channels, you flipped through that old Bible that was the TV guide, and you'd mark it, and you'd make sure darn well that you were in front of the TV set at 11:30 at night when Night of the Blood Beast was going to be on or whatever, because you never knew if you'd see it again. And that
Mhm.
was the same with theaters. I'm a military brat. My dad's retired Army. And back in the 70s and 80s, the theaters there would only screen a movie like they'd only screen one movie a day.
Mm.
And so you'd literally, in like a 7-day programming week, servicemen were not going to sit around watching the same movie 5 or 6 times in a row, and so they had to cross program a lot. And this was before home video, so you could go into the military theaters and you'd get this little single color trifold piece of paper that had all the movies in the theaters
Mm.
listed. And you could, on a Monday, you could go see a kung fu movie. On a Tuesday, you could go see a Star Wars ripoff. On a Wednesday, you could see a horror movie. On a Thursday, you could see a Disney cartoon or a Ray Harryhausen movie. It was that diverse. And so
Mm.
my parents could never understand why I wanted to see the really weird, obscure stuff when I was at those military theaters. And it was like, Mom, this is not going to be on TV. Well, of course, flash to 30, 40 years later, but at that time you didn't know. So it's like,
Right.
gee, do I go see Star Wars again at the military theater, or do I go see The Incredible Melting Man? Ma, guess which one I chose. Yeah, and then around that time, I started reading Famous Monsters of Filmland and
Mhm.
Fangoria, of course. And another real formative thing for me was starting to read like film reviews in
Oh.
the newspaper, and that kind of started to form. It started to form an interest in writing about film for me. And to this day, I mean, one of my formative influences was a gentleman who wrote for the Seattle PI back when that was still a newspaper, a writer named William Arnold. I still, to this day, when I write reviews, I write them with the template that he sort of had set up as a writer. Um, and and that the great thing about that is it made horror movies. They became my gateway drug to cinema, and I found myself stumbling into all sorts of things that I probably would have never watched otherwise. I mean, well, the classic example I always use is I was 9 years old, and back when I was 9 years old, there wasn't any cable TV or home video.
Mhm.
So the only station that would show movies that weren't kind of mainstream Hollywood movies was PBS, the PBS station, and they would show art films, and they would show silent movies, and they would show Shakespearean adaptations. And I will never forget, I was going through a TV guide, and they had a listing for Hamlet, the 1948 Laurence Olivier Hamlet. And somewhere about seventh or eighth on the billing list, because they had a full cast list in the TV guide for some reason, was Peter Cushing.
Mhm.
Wonderful British actor. If you're not familiar with him, he played Dr. Frankenstein as well as Van Helsing, Stitcher of Limbs, Staker of Hearts. Great Shakespearean trained actor, but he had a small part in Olivier's Hamlet. And I knew the name Shakespeare, and I had no idea, any context.
Mhm.
And next thing I know, I'm 9 years old, and I'm sitting down in front of a TV set, and I'm watching Shakespeare, and I'm getting into it, and I'm kind of understanding it. And all because a guy that I liked in a horror movie was in it. And then from there, it kind of snowballs. And I think that's anybody who loves cinema in general, there's usually some genre or some movie that's kind of the gateway drug for you. So that was, and yeah, grade school, I was writing horror movie reviews on 3-ring binder paper. In junior high, I wrote for my junior high paper. I wrote for my high school paper. I won a Washington Journalism Education Award in high school. I won another one in college. I spent a long time kind of building an arts career. I worked at Seattle Opera for several years. And about 10 or 11 years ago, I had kind of tapered off from writing. And then about 10 or 11 years ago, I got back into it again, and like in a big way. And that was when I started writing for the Sunbreak. It was mostly music coverage. But the great thing back then was that it was an overall culture like website. And so, I mean, I got to interview Melvin Van Peebles, the legendary director of Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song, which is basically the first blaxploitation movie. That was like one of my first interviews out of the gate. I'm sitting in the lobby of the Sorrento, surrounded by crushed velvet, talking to Sweet Sweetback. It was, and what a character, what a great bunch of stories. And that's kind of getting back to the whole interview thing. That was where I started learning to do interviews, and stopped being quite as starstruck and intimidated as I was when I was younger, and that was where I kind of started to pick that up too. So I don't know if that covers everything, in terms of that's a very, very condensed little, speedball of dorkiness for you there.
No, I learned a lot, and that's fascinating to me. I start when you're talking about the horror being the gateway to a lot of other genres of cinema.
Yeah.
I start thinking back to the old Crossroads Cinema here in Bellevue, Washington, where I saw Evil Dead 2. I saw Reanimator. I saw all these things that I saw them as they happened, and they're not rated at the time. And my mom would go with me, and she's like, "What movie are we seeing?" Because she liked horror, but she didn't like that kind of horror
My mom,
necessarily.
the same with my mom. And actually, that's somebody that I should really credit that for too, because my dad was stationed in the Army, and my mom was stuck with two bored snot-nosed kids. And what could you do in the late 70s to occupy those kids but drag them to a movie theater, or in my mom's case, have yourself dragged to the movie theater by one of those kids? So I'm with you. For you, it was the Bellevue Crossroads. For me, there was a little theater called the Parkland Theater that was just across the street from Pacific Lutheran University in Parkland, Washington. That theater used to show double features, and it would show second run quality, mainstream movies. But then the first run stuff it would show would almost always be horror movies. And the first double bill I saw there was At the Earth's Core and The Land That Time Forgot, which are these two British like giant dinosaur movies with Doug McClure and Peter Cushing's and At the Earth's Core. So yeah, those there's something about the theatrical experience, and where it's kind of like those theaters are crucibles for you, you know? They
Yeah,
force your fondness for that stuff. So I can
for
relate.
sure. Yeah, and as you were talking, one thing that kind of stuck in my head was that did you go to college for journalism? Is it something that you were formally working on since you were writing from such a young age, or is it something that you've just done on your own?
I mean, that was my emphasis when I was in school. Yeah, but the time goes by. You kind of, you know, the world changes a little bit. I mean, again, I sort of stumbled into working at a major nonprofit arts organization, and that kind of became my career for a long time.
Hmm.
And then as I was doing it, I was still blogging. I mean, somewhere out there's a little blog that I started, and the last time I wrote in it was like probably 9 years ago. But that was where I kind of was every now and again doing writing. So I mean, it was. I mean, it's something that I had intended to embark on as a chosen, as a chosen field, but it didn't really. It started to become my passion and something that I was doing on a consistent basis relatively recently, by my history, probably about 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago.
Okay.
Not that long before I met you, honestly.
Right. Yeah. Just kind of doing the math in my head.
Yeah.
So, and that's actually a perfect segue. Let's talk about Crypticon. For those that are watching this, it's a horror genre convention. We have a branch of it here in Seattle that runs in May. It used to be over Memorial Day weekend. Now it's usually the first weekend in May. Of course, because of the pandemic, they've moved it to September. So we'll kind of keep our fingers crossed if that's going to actually happen.
Yeah.
And that's where Tony and I first met. It was my first year being credentialed there as a media member, his first year there as a moderator of topic panels and celebrity guest panels. And so how did that come to be? How did you get involved with the Crypticon Seattle people?
It started with a barbecue. I was invited to a barbecue, and I was at this barbecue, and I saw this guy with sideburns and a pork pie hat wearing a Dracula Prince of Darkness t-shirt at this barbecue. And of course, immediately I'm like, that's my tribe right there. So I walk up to him and I'm like, dude, you're rocking a Hammer t-shirt. That is so killer. So of course we proceed to have this 2.5 hour long conversation, to the exclusion of most everybody else at the party. And this happened to be Nick Gucker, who's a really great artist, and he does actually the illustrations for Crypticon, for the posters, and also for the t-shirts and the graphics for the programs. And as we kept talking, he was like, you really know your stuff. Wow. I think you should meet somebody. And he hooked me up with Eric Morgret, who at the time was scheduling panels and also booking celebrities for the panels. And Eric Morgret, hello, great guy, great salt of the earth guy. We had a nice long talk over coffee in Capitol Hill, and he said, well, do you want to do panels? And I'm like, hell yes. He was actually, ironically enough, having a lot of problems getting somebody to do panels, celebrity panels, which absolutely stymied me, because how could you not find somebody who would be willing to sit down with a childhood hero or a childhood crush, for like 45 minutes to an hour of undivided attention and just talk to them, And I was like, yes, so he scheduled me. And you were there that first year. So I was very fortunate to do a panel with Rico Browning, the original creature from the Black Lagoon. It went great. I did a panel with Don Coscarelli, the director of Phantasm, who was awesome. We ended up getting off on a tangent and talking about everything but Phantasm, which is pretty funny. Dee Wallace, I interviewed that year, and that year I also had the very great honor of interviewing on the same panel Richard Kiel, who was Jaws in the Bond films, as well as Marilyn Burns, the scream queen par excellence from the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And then it just went from there. And the whole time, I mean, I sort of accidentally stumbled into being dressed up. I mean, this is my shtick now, is that I wear like right now, talking to you, I am wearing a dress shirt, a tie, slacks, and some damn fine dress shoes. I stumbled into that when I did my first panels that Friday night. This was before the celebrity panels, but I was coming off of work at the opera. I was managing the box office, and so I didn't have time to get from work to home to the SeaTac Hilton to do the panel. And so I was just like, okay, screw it, I'm going. And so I ended up coming in the way I'm, traditionally dressed when I go to Crypticon. And I just sort of kept doing it. And I didn't really think about it at the time, but it's sort of a shtick. I mean, I guess it's my shtick. It's my trademark. But one of the reasons I've kept it up is because when I've been doing these celebrity interviews, it's just kind of a measure of respect for me. I always treat these things. I mean, I have no problem with celebrities being chill and being in their t-shirts and shorts and stuff. That's totally awesome. But from where I'm coming from, I treat it as an interview. I treat it as a serious journalistic interview. And so that's where, wearing a shirt and tie and kind of presenting yourself with some professionalism, really, it registers positively. I mean, people know that I respect the person I'm talking to. The person that I'm talking to knows I have respect for them. So yeah, that's kind of how it started. And I've been doing, last year was my 8th Crypticon. I have been incalculably lucky, and I've had a chance to interview so many, I mean, literally childhood heroes. When I was 12 years old, I saw Phantasm first run in a movie theater. I was absolutely, that movie captured my imagination. I could tell it was cheap as hell, but I could also tell there was so much imagination behind it. And that was a 20-something-year-old kid who made that movie. That's Don Coscarelli. And I got to talk to him for an hour. And after we were done, he said, "You know what, Tony, that is easily the best interview I've ever had at a convention panel. Thank you so much." And
wow.
that was I mean, I'm sure he wouldn't remember me from Adam today because it's been 8 years ago and he's made at least one movie in the interim. But it's been exciting. It's been a lot of fun.
I remember at that exact same year in 2012 when I was doing my audio interview with Doug Bradley, Pinhead from the Hellraiser films, for those out there watching this, that I got to the end of my questions and I asked him one, and Doug's response was he had to sit there and think about it and said, "You know what? No one's ever asked me that before." And that's how I was like, ka-ching.
There you go. Exactly. Yeah. So, and one of the things that I learned doing these Crypticon interviews is you have to find a balance between what the audience is interested in hearing and also what engages the subject. You can only, I mean, it would be very easy for me to go deep dive and super inside baseball with a lot of these interviews. But if you're there in an audience with an audience of a couple hundred people, there's only so much of the super obscure micro minutia that they're gonna care about, which is something it's a very hard line to straddle when you talk to somebody who's had a 50-year career or a 60-year career. So, but it's a fun challenge, as because you've done interviews yourself. It's a fun challenge to kind of find that balance between what people are going to want to read and what's going to kind of engage and surprise your subject and your audience.
Yeah, no, I couldn't have said it better. You're always trying to find that balance, and I don't think I ever find it where it's like, oh yeah, I know exactly what I'm going to do here, because as soon as the guest starts talking and maybe they've had a bad morning, then I'm going to shift depending on that body language, their responses to me. Maybe I'm a little bit more empathetic, or could be they come in there and they're on fire and they can't wait to jump into a jumping jack over here, and they're like, "Oh, wait a minute, because I remember the Dee Wallace interview that you did in 2012, and I was like, holy moly! I mean, she was actually scaring me a little bit because I had an interview with her the next day. I'm like, oh man,
that was one of my favorite moments. Actually, was doing the interview with her, because as you know, she's a fireball and she's absolutely adorable. And when I was talking to her at that panel, I was asking her about The Howling. And I was talking to her because there's something about her performance in that movie. There's an enormous amount of melancholy and a lot of vulnerability, because that character goes through a lot of dark stuff in the movie. And so I asked her, where did you find the wherewithal, kind of the strength and the energy to go to these really super dark places and to really emote them, because you really do in the movie. She leans over very close to me. I don't know if you remember this. She puts both of her hands on my forearm, and she just looks at me with those very lovely blue eyes and goes, "I have no idea." And I'm like, okay, that's the kind of shit you live for when you're doing these interviews. You know, I've gotten taken off guard pleasantly a few times, and that was definitely one of them. And yeah, it's a lot of it is just about kind of shifting your, you know. And I don't know about you, but the other thing that I do is I do prepare, like, big time. I always have a typed out question list. I always make sure it's at least 2 pages, at least 20 questions, and that helps because there may be a point where you go through, you know, a half an hour of talking and you want to open it up to the audience, and maybe it's crickets just because people are shy or whatever. And then you give it 10 seconds and boom, you go to another question and you keep it going. So yeah, it's I really love doing it. I, you know, if I could monetize it somehow, I'd be down, you know, but yeah.
Yeah, you and me both.
I know that's the eternal creatives conundrum, you know.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, so we've got about 1.5 minutes left of our session.
Oh,
I knew it was going to fly by. I had a bunch of other things to ask about. I probably could have talked to you for 3 hours. Oh, now I got 1 minute left. What
okay.
do you have coming up that you're working? Because I know you have a podcast or maybe even a couple podcasts. So can you plug those real quick?
Yeah. Well, I still write about music for artisthome.org, which is a wonderful PR company that's also helping to keep live music alive and live music venues alive here in Seattle. I currently write for thesunbreak.com, which is a movie lifestyle sort of virtual magazine. And I'm a co-host on the City of Geek podcast. All of these things can be found online. Feel free to hit me up at Anthony James K on Facebook. I am Tony K, TonyKay writer on Twitter. And City of Geek is available wherever fine podcasts are casted.
Tony, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been awesome catching up with you. And I hope that things work in our favor where I can see you again in September.
I'm counting on it, Mark, and thank you so much for the invite. I really appreciate it, and best of luck to you and Alice on the tour, man. Just keep on keeping on, man.
All right, thank you. Have a good night.
You too.